One of the queries that we get asked on the regular is about stocking densities and having a happy tank. And this is always a really difficult topic to give advice on, just because it's so hard to plan for the future and to know exactly how it's all going to turn out. I think the key things is having an action plan to mitigate incidences through social aggression. So the way that we look at it is that to make sure that all animals are getting enough food. If they're getting enough food, they can remain strong, they can remain competitive, and they can try and fight for their place in the hierarchy. And this is really important because a weak fish that doesn't get enough food gets picked on, gets dropped down to the bottom of the hierarchy, and then dies through emaciation or lack of feeding. And these are normally the ones that you can pick. They might have lost all their color, they're the last to feed, they'll take food in and then spit it out. And these are all issues that are getting caused by social pressure. So we try and mitigate that as much as possible. So one option is to having fish that aren't as competitive with each other. So if you were going to do an all male peacock tank, all those males look the same, they all fight for the same girls, therefore the chances they're all going to fight with each other. This is something you build into. Our suggestion is to add other fish into that tank to add the numbers, but will not be directly competitive to the rest of the fish. So it's about having different populations of fish that feed in different ways. This brings us on to resource guarding. So it's important to make sure that all fish get fed appropriate, but also that one or two fish, the dominant ones, don't outcompete everyone. So make an example, with one fish that's getting all the food, fill his mouth up with like a low protein food, but that fills his mouth up, that you can then add as a higher protein food to all the smaller fish. So this is what we do with this tank. We've got goldhead comps in there, we've got tropheus in there, we've got peacocks in there, and we've got baboon in there. And they're all kind of fighting for their space, but it's important to ensure that the little comps get that higher diet. So feed the larger fish a pellet food with nori, and then feed in brine shrimp to get the really good nutritious stuff into it. And we always feel the more raw it is, the more closer to its native product, i.e. Shrimp. You don't want shrimp meal, you want shrimp. That's the best way to go. The other way to mitigate aggression is to make sure that the tank is really full, which is a great way by having different species all working together to fill up the tank, because there's not as much resource guarding, but it creates the jungle gym effect, so the crowd effect. So if one person's getting chased, you want that person to be able to dash into a group of people and to disappear. And that's what we go for, so high stocking densities. We see it with the chickens. We've got chickens that we keep in a dome, and when we move that dome around and we let them out, those chickens suddenly became uber aggressive because there's a whole lot of marbles available, so space. So by spreading and controlling the environment in terms of the size of the environment and how many animals are in with that population, you can mitigate aggression. Finally, we look at temperature. We run our tanks at a lower temp, and this ensures that they're able to processing of food isn't as high. Therefore, the resource guarding for more food, because they're getting hungry. Let's be realistic. The more you eat, the hungrier you get, right? It's the way your body works. So we're going to try and mitigate that by having slightly lower temperatures, and therefore not having as much aggression as what we would normally expect. Finally, the other way to look at it is you want that tank to be a jungle gym. So I know everyone thinks of Malawi as a rock-only environment, and I think this is quite flawed. So all along the shoreline, sticks and stones all the time, right? So one of the things we do is we use skinny branches. We like to use native tree branches. I know someone asked us the other day what we're using, how we're getting it right, and I flippantly replied magic. And what I really mean is, it's if you pick the right thing, you don't have to do anything to it. So good New Zealand natives, slow growing trees, cool gnarled branches, that's what we look at. We don't do anything that's bogwood, anything that's come out of a tannin rich environment. So skinny branches as tall up in the topper reaches of the tank to provide the jungle gym effect. You want those fish to be able to hide on that side of a branch, kind of, you can't get me, that type of effect. So those are mitigating factors that we try and use to suppress aggression, or at least affect that. And realistically, it's always going to be there, right? So as long as the fish have got a good food source, they're happy, they're healthy, lots of oxygen. Anytime they get injured, you mitigate that as much as possible with stuff like melafix, so just preventing any further infection. And finally, the most important thing really is applying a tank with the right pH. I really do believe that the animals are way more prone to have fungal and bacterial infections in the medium pH range, right? So whereas if you're up in like the 8.2, somewhere above the 8 mark and a pH, it becomes an inhospitable environment for the standard bacteria, and that's why we see it, so many people struggle with it. Whereas if we run our tanks at 8.2 and a nice hardness, we very rarely see any further infection, just because the base environment kind of isn't really congruent to it. So I hope that makes sense. So slightly lower water temps, lots of decoration, lots of fish that don't necessarily compete with each other, and the appropriate foods to make sure that everyone's thriving. You know, if your biggest, most dominant fish are smashing the food, lower the amount of food that's going to them, keep them happy, but make sure that they're not putting as much weight on, bulk on. And if one fish gets uber large for the tank, you might, and it's a dominant species, you might want to move that fish on and replace it with a smaller version of that to let the rest of your crew grow up, and maybe that dude will toe the line. So hopefully this all makes sense. It's a social environment, so there's never ever guarantees, so these are just tidbits that we think helps. So I hope this all makes sense. Cheers. Creating natural looking aquariums that are easy to maintain.